It's a remarkable thing to grasp because when you really understand the reasons, that is when you can impact and change and control to some extent, and also build alliances with the most unlikely of enemies, being super careful when I describe those complex dynamics and complex systems.
Biggest barrier we have in empathy, whether it's leaders, whether it's ourselves, whether it's our interactions, the biggest barrier is insecurity.
Sometimes intentionally emotionally closing yourself off is the best way to assist the individual with whom you are existing in that space. But sometimes it is something that you're automatically doing because you're exhausted.
Welcome to the Tyler Dickerhoof Show with me, your host, Tyler Dickerhoof. On today's episode, I have the wonderful Shermin Kruse joining me. She is a globally recognized negotiation consultant, law professor, author, TEDx producer. She has worked in the area of transformative work in empathy, stoicism, complex negotiation. I imagine she developed that probably the most with her 4 children. Shermin, I am so excited to have this conversation and spend time with you today.
So Tyler, I gotta say, this thing that you do where you change your pitch and your tone depending on the word that you're saying so that you don't sound monotone. And
Yeah.
I don't know if it's something you do intentionally and naturally, or if it's something you have adopted and learned to do just as a podcaster, as a speaker, et cetera. But it is freaking brilliant, my friend, because I will tell you, it is so exhilarating just to listen to your show. It is, and I think a lot of it is you keep it moving. And a lot of the ways you do that is just through your tone and your pitch and your intonation. It's really great. I love it. I have to just stop the podcast and comment on that for a minute.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And now we're going to talk about empathy. And we talked about a little bit this before. To me, what you just displayed was a what I call a start of empathy. And here's how, let me define how I define empathy. And I would love for you to just, you have a much different definition. I've read your book, Stoic Empathy. To me, empathy is putting your arms around someone and walking with them. That's how I define it. And, obviously Stoic empathy, your definition is different. But what I appreciate about you doing that is as you recognize something, you're willing to say, hey, through this conversation, I'm going to put my arms around you and walk with you. And we're going to do this together. And you found a way to do that. Now, that's the front. Let me share this piece. I spoke a lot when I was growing up. I was in 4-H, I was in FFA. I did speaking in those organizations. And I had a coach when I was in college. He said, Tyler, go listen to Paul Harvey. And so my job one summer, my internship was to listen to Paul Harvey. And part of it is I had to learn how to slow down. But if you go listen to Paul Harvey, Paul does an amazing, and Grant passed away, but he does an amazing job of touching emotion and touching the person by his use of words and pause and inflection. And so it makes it feel like you're sitting right there just waiting for the next words. And so I did that for years and not realizing that it would affect me 25 years later, but it did. So I can't say that I necessarily do. Is it natural? Probably, because I was told to focus on and learn.
Yeah. That's fair. And it's become second nature to you at this point. I have to say, with your definition of empathy, which, by the way, I agree with, I just would add more to it.
Yeah, let's go.
Having said that, I don't disagree with that definition at all. That is certainly a form of empathy, and it is a very, very commonly understood form of empathy, and it is a very powerful form of empathy. And it's probably the form that empathy most frequently takes in our daily interactions. The extension I've added to it is not to minimize what you've just described, because that is such an incredible thing to be able to do, right? I always describe it to folks, especially folks that maybe have a little bit of a hard time with emotional connection. I describe it, you're watching your favorite TV show, right? You're watching your favorite TV show. The character you have followed for 3 seasons gets in the car, is finally, after all their troubles, having this incredible, successful, happy moment. And you feel all this cortisol leaving your body as a viewer, and you're so invested in this character. And they get in the car and they're driving, and it's a sunny day, and the rays shine through the glass, and the music's going, and the guy's phone beeps, and he looks down, and you have this, oh crap, feeling right away. Right. And of course, a car comes out of nowhere. Your guy swerves into oblivion. There's shattered glass. What do? You physically recoil. Yes, you physically recoil. Now, maybe you gasp, maybe you jump, maybe you don't do any of those things, except maybe you just tense your shoulders a little bit. But you are having a neurological, emotional, and physical reaction, even though nothing happened to you. The glass did not cut your face, right? And yet you feel pain. You don't feel glass cutting pain, but you feel pain in response to the character's pain. And this character is fictional. They're not even real, right? And so take that and connect it more, if you allow yourself, to a real person, right? And it can be that feeling of connection, that feeling of your pain in my heart, right? Or as you said it, Tyler, my arm around you as we walk so that our steps are synced, right? That feeling is multiplied. That is an extraordinary way to conceive of empathy. I applaud you for approaching your life that way. What I wanted to do was I wanted to understand the definition of empathy, first science reliant, because I wanted to make sure social psychologists as well as neurologists would agree with me.
As a multiple degree, holder. That's
100%.
Yes.
As extending to someone who you would never put your arm around, right? I mean, it is someone for whom you would never feel an emotional connection, but with whom you are syncing your steps so that you can better understand their journey, right? So it is the step part of your analogy without necessarily the arm part of your analogy. And I would even go a step further. It's also everything in between. It's I'm putting steps, but I'm standing really close to you, but I'm sinking steps, but I'm standing further away, or I'm sinking steps. It depends on my level of trust, my level of comfort, right? My power in the dynamic of the couplehood, and also what my long-term goal here is. Is my long-term goal to have a positive, meaningful relationship, whether it's a professional relationship, right? We're 2 companies, we just merged, post-merger integration is essential. Or is it immediate? You're trying to hostily take over my board. And I need to understand where you're coming from so I can get rid of you. No part of me wants to keep walking with you forever, right?
Yeah.
But I do need to understand where you're coming from. I need to sync my steps with you, and that is a real issue. And there's a big difference between you and the guy I really want to merge with, right? And so that has been the goal of Stoic empathy, is bringing that extension in without in any way reducing the significance or importance of the emotional connection of the your pain in my heart. And also conceding that often there's a component of that, even if you're distancing yourself. Again, your arm might not be all the way around the person, but you might be walking really side by side with your faces close to one another in a manner that is intimate, right? That is friendship oriented, right? Or you might not.
You talk about this in, both of your books, whether it's your first book, whether it's your second book, and it's this idea of what you experienced as a young girl. And the, being in Tehran during the conflict then, and just, the terror really is how I read it and understand it. And then where you're at now and evolving so many years later, and that growth and development. where has what you just said about this understanding the situation you're in and how much to elicit trust and that connection of putting your arm around someone or just walking in step with them? How has that been developed through your own personal experiences?
Well, here's the thing. So when I was growing up in Iran, I basically led a double life, which a lot of people, yeah, living in oppressive regimes, they do because everyone's watching you. The regime is watching you, and so are the neighbors to some extent. And so the external image you present of yourself in order to keep yourself safe and keep your family safe is not in sync with your authentic self. It's intentionally out of sync, right? And you have to do this even as a child, which is very confusing to a kid. And it's extreme. It is in one scenario, I'm chanting death to such and such, and in the other scenario, I'm trying to go there to live because of how much I value their way of life, right? And it's the difference between an afternoon, right? And so it's extreme, and it is sometimes with highly moral issues, but it's that or death, right? And not just your death, it's also your child's death or your mother's death, right? So it's easy to understand why people do it and how they get very good at it. And it is also extraordinarily confusing. And so, one of the things I learned to do as a child in balancing this is figuring out how to engage in this maneuvering, right? Whether it was an encounter with the morality police on the streets, or a conversation with a teacher in the schoolyard, or helping my mother prepare for a family party where everyone was going to take off their hijab and drink illegal alcohol that we bought from someone's bathtub, right? So whether any of those things are happening, I had to modulate my approach to the understanding. And then I had to intuit that understanding and even stating that understanding is not conceding, right? And that allowing yourself to acknowledge someone else's reality does not make that reality true. And there was so much power in that, but there's also massive empathy in that, right? And so for me, it was a pivotal component of growing up and my childhood in Iran. And then my family sort of moved to the West, and I was suddenly told I could be myself and I could still do all these things. And how wonderful is this? And it's great. And it is true to a large extent, and it is not 100% true,
Yeah.
especially if you're a leader, right? And especially if you want to be in the corporate world, there is still a balancing act, right? That we should walk, partly to protect those more vulnerable, our 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 employees, our families, right? As the case might be. Partly to protect ourselves. And yet at the same time, there is now room for all this remarkable appreciation and empathic authenticity, which can enrich our lives and our psyches and, minimize our therapy sessions so extensively. And so maneuvering that balance on a much more, shall we say, fine grain level in the corporate world than perhaps you would in a dictatorial, oppressive regime.
So, that context, if we look at our world today, in the United States, we're led by an individual who's been described as a master negotiator. And yet, oftentimes, people are like, I can't believe he is associating with these other people because of either their professed values or whatever different ideologies, right? If you go from Russia to North Korea, even Iran, whatever else. How much do you recognize with what you've worked in this idea of empathy is that's actually a negotiation tactic to kind of diffuse what their ideology of like the I'm not going to sit down at a table with you because I know you're going to try to force something on me, as opposed to somebody who comes in and says, hey, I'm sitting out at the table and no one sat down with you before. How much of that is an extension of empathy? Like you just said, hey, I'm going to walk side by side with you. I'm not necessarily putting my arm around you and saying, how can I make my country like yours? Is that fair to kind of describe?
I don't know that I would apply it in the way that you have to the current political regime, but I think it can be applied to politics. I think that it is fair to say only Nixon could go to China. I think there is some things that are fair to say. I will say, as a Stoic empathy negotiator, I am 100% supportive of, dude, sit across from anyone. Right? Whether it's Fidel Castro, the president of Iran, right? With whom I have a very personally disruptive relationship, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he's dead, but Stalin, right? I mean, so it's you can sit down with anyone. Be incredibly careful who you trust and who you empathize with. The tricky thing about politics, which is why I distinguish it, is that it is almost never a bilateral negotiation. It is a multilateral negotiation. So who you speak with and how you speak with them affects all of your other negotiations. And if you're a country, those other negotiations are extremely complex, right? It's 150 other sovereigns and all of their sectors and all of their industries and their state departments and their diplomats and so there is a massive, the system is so much more complex than just the bilateral or even a trilateral or even a quadrilateral. So that introduces all sorts of components that make it, and I'm happy to discuss things in those complex terms, but they just add a mass amount of complexity to, okay, I agree that in principle I should be able to sit down and speak with anyone, and I will sit down and speak with anyone, but how I do it, the approach I take, and making sure that I'm also progressing all of my other relationships forward in a beneficial manner, or at least the ones I want to keep, right? The ones I find valuable, is also a significant component of empathy towards them, right? Versus just the person I'm sitting across. Because, this whole thing, your enemy's enemy is my friend, but also your friend's enemy, is that your enemy? Probably not. But you need to acknowledge the fact that they are your friend's enemy. And so that is an important acknowledgement. And how good is this friend? And how important is that? And if you suddenly want to be friends with your friend's enemy, what does that mean for you? And then, multiply that by 150 and then multiply it by all of the characters running each of those countries. So the ripple effect becomes incredibly complex. The underlying point, sit across from anyone, doesn't change, right? In fact, the underlying point of understand the humanity in anyone, or understand that. Now, I have a friend in the FBI. He believes genuinely that evil exists in this world, and there's some people out there who are just evil, and he's seen some stuff, man, and I don't feel like I'm in a position to tell him that he's wrong. I come from a different perspective, which is nobody thinks they're evil, whereas evil thinks it's evil. Evil enjoys evil, right?
I understand what you're
Wouldn't
saying.
you say, 99.999% of bad guys, they think they're doing the right thing, or they think they were backed into it. They have some sort of...
They think they're doing whatever they're doing for the right reasons in their mind.
That's what people think. Everyone is the Neo of their own Matrix story, right? And so everyone is the lead character of their own book. That is how most people approach a situation, a negotiation, a global transaction, as well as a personal relationship. And so if you understand that and you don't just assign to them evil motivations, but rather try to understand whether what they're doing is wrong, it's still, or even self-interested, they have their reasons. And their reasons to them are not selfish. And it's a remarkable thing to grasp, because when you really understand the reasons, that is when you can impact and change and control to some extent, and also build alliances, right, with the most unlikely of enemies. Again, being super careful when I describe those complex dynamics and complex systems. Yeah.
What I love and appreciate is the fact is, as outsiders, it's really hard to take things for face value. Because one, you're not in every single conversation. You haven't been a part of every other conversation. You don't necessarily understand all those dynamics, which in leadership is often the case. And, think of organizations and you going through a merger acquisition and people are like, man, why the heck are we doing this? This seems like they were our enemy yesterday and now we're merging. And yet what you just said is, hey, sometimes just the start of that process yields so many results that no one can see except for the leader who sees everything. And I think there's a part of understanding, and this is my belief, the biggest barrier we have in empathy. This is my belief. I'd love for you to kind of engage, interact, tell me your thoughts. Whether it's leaders, whether it's ourselves, whether it's our interactions. The biggest barrier is insecurity. Because let me just talk about a leader, say, for example, and they think what they're doing is right, whether it's right for them or right for their people. And the difference sometimes is, are they focused more on what's right for them because their insecurity says, unless you show force, unless you do whatever, right? And this could be in a boardroom or a country. I don't think it matters. Unless you show force, they're not going to think you're a very good leader. They're not going to think that you have value. They're not going to believe X, Y, and Z. And so my main belief, what held me up from being authentic and empathetic was my insecurity and the protection I tried to put over my insecurities of having value, of having worth. And as I've walked through that personally, and I've seen the solution to that is actually being vulnerable, allowing myself to be empathetic. Because once I do that, it's actual strength. And recognize my insecurity. That's what makes connection able, because I'm not worried about protecting me. I'm worried about, hey, how can I connect with you?
And Tyler, I feel the way you do it, you might present a vulnerability or an insecurity, I would even call it, which is very normal and natural, and there's nothing wrong with it. You might do that, but you never do it in a way that makes you come across as weak. And here's the thing. It's fascinating to me, particularly if somebody was our enemy yesterday, right? They do have it out for us. They didn't change from yesterday. But there might be reasons why this alliance might be fruitful going forward. So for both of us, right? But I'm not going to suddenly think you're my best friend because I'm not an idiot, right? But I am going to try to understand your motivations and where you're coming from. And I am going to reevaluate my strategic relationship with you, right? But I'm not going to forget all the stuff you did. Right? So there's a difference between those two things. And the reality is, I can even present a vulnerability or an insecurity, but it's very important to me that you know that if you enter into this deal with me, whether it's a merger, right, or a political agreement, that I have the strength to pull it off and pull it off well. I am strong enough to be trustworthy because there is something about total weakness or even substantial weakness that makes someone untrustworthy. How many people have you met in your life who are perfectly lovely people, but you can't trust them as far as you can throw them because at every tip of the curve, they change directions, And so it's, they're not really led by anything. They're barely in control of themselves. So if they're not even in control of themselves, how are they going to be able to come through for you? Why would they be a good partner to you in this merger or political transaction or personal relationship? Right? Let's say it's a marriage. Let's say it's a friendship, whatever it is, right? So the reason I compare it more to personal relationships than political arrangements is that they tend to be a little bit less complex, so they're a little bit easier to talk about, because a personal relationship, some folks are just always going to be your allies. I don't know if you got folks like that who, even if like they could murder someone, show up at your house with blood on their hands, and you might slap him in the face and say, you idiot, what have you done now? But you're going to go hide him in the basement. Like, let's just be honest. That's going to happen, right? There's other people, they show up at your house with blood on their hands. You're going to call the freaking cops. Like, you're not going to hide them in your basement, right? There's a difference between how you approach these two categories of people in business and in our personal lives and in politics. It's very important that we draw that distinction and that distinction be made on an intelligent cognitive analysis as opposed to an emotional impulse, right? You pushed me, so I'm mad at you. So now I'm not going to hide you in my basement, even though you're my brother and you hid me the last 2 times I was unjustly accused of, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I anticipate you're going here, and where the hard is the emotion. And if we allow our emotion to be, again, this comes back to insecurity for me. If I allow my insecurities to drive my emotional responses, then my insecurity has the best of me. But if I'm willing to say, hey, I have insecurities, I know when they show because I've done the work to understand that. And yet, even in that, I'm willing to be vulnerable because I understand that vulnerability is strength because I've realized that everyone has insecurities. And the strong are the really ones to say, yeah, I got a bump on my nose and whatever else. And like sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And as much as we can say that, and if you can live that because you have emotional control, which I think is very interesting to me, as you bring in stoicism, is the practice to understand, hey, it is what it is, right? And to me, that's very much the element, kind of a short little quip. It is what it is. So you can either hate it or you can accept it, and hating it is not going to get you anywhere. I think that's what's so interesting about this approach of Stoic empathy is it's gaining control of emotions, not to eliminate them, but understanding how and when to use them. That's what I gather. I would love for you to just take and run with that.
I mean, as usual, you're spot on. And this is the cool thing about—
that doesn't go well for a conversation, which you just agree. It's better when you say, well, Tyler, that's
incorrect.
great, but you missed this piece.
Yeah, let me reevaluate that. It missed 77 things, 77.7. So here's the thing, though. The ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, and to some extent, the ancient Buddhists and the ancient Mesopotamians, but we're focusing on the Stoics right now. The ancient Stoics understood something that somehow got interpreted to mean emotional denial 2,000 years later. But what it really means in modern linguistics is emotional regulation, right? This is, and what Aristotle said, and I don't have the quote in front of me, so I might mess it up. I'm sorry to any big Aristotle fans out there, but I want to experience my feeling at a time that is right, in a place that is appropriate, in a way that is appropriate, right? I want to be able to express my feeling in the way that I want to express that feeling. He never said, I don't want to have feelings, right? It's more about how do I wrap my arms around this whole emotion thing, right? Acknowledge that there's going to be some components of it that are going to be voluntary, but that at the end of the day, even if it takes as long as it takes to quit smoking, right? It might be a habit, it might be an instinct, but I can affect it if it's my feeling, if it's my judgment, if it's my thought, right? In fact, that is the thing in the world I have the most control over, not the least, right? That doesn't mean I can't control anything else. The leaders who listen to your show know, they walk into a room, people listen to them. They control things, right? External politics and external power dynamics are real, and guns are real. If there's a gun held to your head, you're going to do what you're told. I mean, you're going to do what you're told, but they don't have to make you think what they want. And there is no one who can do that, right? And that is, and again, sometimes it's a lot harder. If you're living in North Korea and you've been the subject of government propaganda and conspiracy theories your whole life, being a free thinker, significantly more difficult than if you're living in a country where there's freedom of press, freedom of movement, freedom of information, right? Freedom of speech. And it's still ultimately your responsibility because these are your thoughts, right? This is your willpower. This is your domain. Now, I might be able to better understand why you think the way you do, right? As someone who's trying to empathize with you. But if you are a practitioner of Stoicism, you are questioning things on your own and figuring it out. Yes, it's harder. And that's why I get it. I get it, man. I get it. And I understand it, and I empathize with you. And it's still on you.
I'm really intrigued by, your experience of being in a world where very much, correct this where I'm wrong, but essentially there were leaders trying to tell you what to think based
Yeah.
upon what they thought, and they were determining
Right.
what you were supposed to think, and by those thoughts, those actions. And to leave that world, and even within that world, as you've described, your family was kind of like, we're not going to play that game. We'll play the game in society, but at home, in our own walls, we're going to play a different game. And then you immigrate to Canada. And all of a sudden now, this is what I gather. This is what I perceive. This is what I've experienced. You've been in a world where outwardly, I'm going to control. And then you come to a world that it is more subversive because by cultural norms, we're going to control what's right or what's wrong. In the conflict of those two, one so outward, one so kind of like obtuse, and you're like, how do I be me and where is it appropriate?
And to what extent, right? I mean, for example, I am a very feminine person, and I enjoy femininity. I think I also paint. I paint female nudes. I think the female body is beautiful, okay? I also think women should be comfortable with their bodies and express themselves in however way they want. I also would never wear a bikini to federal court. I mean, again, both of those things can be true. And the reason is that particular location is really not the place for me to be demonstrating that idea. I am there to represent a client as an advocate, right? This is for when I was still practicing law. I'm there to represent a client. My job, and even everything that pertains to protecting my reputation in that context, right? My job is to win this case. And that is my goal. Now, I could wake up one day and say, it is my mission to prove to judges in the federal court that a woman in a bikini can be just as smart as a guy in a suit. And that is what's valuable to me. So I show up in my bikini, I argue my case, I lose it, I win it, whatever, I come across as smart, I leave, nobody ever hires me again. Okay, so that's the consequence, but I accomplished my mission. So as long as you are clear what your goal is, and you are clear regarding the most likely consequences of your actions in terms of how they accomplish that goal and the consequences of the goal, you can decide yourself how much authenticity is appropriate. There is a ton of research stating that a certain amount is essential for you to lead a useful, happy, emotionally fulfilled life, right? And that's something you talk about a lot on your show, is just, be yourself. And that's sort of the base amount. But all of it, everywhere, all at once, right? I mean, that doesn't seem like that would be appropriate.
But to me, that is, and again, as we're sharing, it's pretty interesting to me. I think about you sharing the idea of, okay, I'm going to show up at a federal courtroom and I'm going to be wearing a bikini. Okay, but here's where I take that. If all of a sudden you're in a, say equally as professional experience, and for you, the best way for you to empathize with either who you represent or who you're interacting with is to show up in a bikini. To me, that is very genuine and authentic. It comes back to this idea of, yes, I've had to learn, if you aren't willing to be authentically you and become comfortable with that, then everyone's going to be a little like, who's the real person here? Because I'm not sure. And it's hard to be empathetic with someone you're kind of like, you were this today, you were that tomorrow. Who the heck are you? But it comes back to this place of being willing to be genuinely authentic at a desire to be empathetic.
Yeah.
And I think it then ties into this idea of the stoicism and saying, okay, instead of I'm going to show up in a bikini and I'm going to show them,
Right. It's
right?
about
And
me.
I'm going to, as opposed to, no, that's not emotionally controlled. That is, I'm going to show up in a bikini because that's the best way to make sure that I can do what I need to do at the best interest of everyone around me. And I'm in control of my emotions, and people might be like, whatever. Like, no, I'm in control. Does that all make sense?
I'm just, as you're talking, I'm thinking about your listeners, and I'm thinking about the cases that they're imagining would cause a lawyer to dress up in a bikini and go to court, and the types of clients that would
I mean, I just see
And
I
I'm
see
coming
Legally
up,
Blonde. I mean, I could
yes,
just imagine Claire Danes.
100%.
I
I'm
mean,
coming up with
that's what
so
it
many
was.
examples.
Yeah,
It's
that's what it
really
was.
true,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Or a
yeah.
sex victim, or whatever, whatever it might be. There could be a lot of reasons. And what I would also say is sometimes, even if it's to your detriment for that case, it is worth it for you to maintain that minimal level of authenticity. And for you, what's minimal might be different than for someone else. So, for example, when I started practicing law, they told me no pants in federal court, only skirts. And they told me no ethnic earrings. This is what I was told in a memo. I mean, it was written down in a written document.
How long
Don't
ago
wear.
was that?
This was, in fairness, it was a minute ago. And listen,
But
I'm old.
what is it in
I'm old.
fairness, or is that context? To me, that context is if we look at our world today, especially in leadership, that's important. It's important because I think it's a day and age where it was more regulated to say, here is A, there is B. And as much as we want to say our world is rife with inequity, we have to stop and realize, no, there's actually a lot more empathy going on and saying, hey, I need you to be the best you. And if that means you show up in pants because you're comfortable, and you have, again, this appropriately authentic that's not going to distract, that doesn't take away what we're trying to, but is you, man, as a leader, I get behind that because that's what's going to bring out the best in you. And I think it really is important for people to stop and recognize, oh, we've improved. And I think what's happened, and to go back, and I want you to weigh on this, I think too often people have not recognized the actual empathy that's occurred, and they try to force it to say, you know what, Shermin, you should show up in a bikini all the time because who dare tell you not to? It's like, whoa, come on, guys, we missed the point here.
Right,
It's not
right.
me. I
Or
mean,
or
if I
or
was
wear
showing up in a bikini, it'd
polyester
be a whole
pants to
different.
the beach. That would be equally absurd. Here's the reason I agree with you. An intellectual, a curious person, someone who asks questions, someone who has an inquiry-based mindset, will seek to look at the whole of a situation. And when they do, they will see the flaws, right? However, if they ignore the non-flawed aspects, right? Or the much improved aspects, or even the damn near perfect aspects of the situation, it will be far more difficult for them to resolve the flaws, right? And they'll be focused on incorrect aspects of the system, or they'll be focused on something that maybe sometimes is glitchy, but really kind of works really well, right? And ignoring the things that are totally broken, right? Completely broken. And so that is dangerous. And I'll tell you, a lot of people do that.
We've lived that for the last several years, right? It's one side wants to be so adamant. To me, it doesn't matter, political sphere. It doesn't matter. They're both in the same boat. They're so wrong. They're so wrong. Not everyone is so wrong. It's not possible.
Well, and I think it's been happening for several thousand years.
Yeah,
I actually
yeah.
think one of the things that's happening, this is a totally separate point, but one of the things that I think is happening in America is that politics and political ideologies displacing religious and spiritual beliefs, because so few people have those core I mean, the way people talk about their political beliefs now, it feels like the way people talked about the Islamic sect they were in when I was a kid. I mean, you guys agree on 90% of the stuff. No, we're very different. I'm like, but are you though? I mean, so it depends on the perspective. So yeah, I would completely agree with that. But what I wanted to go back to say is, listen, sometimes you're going to when I was a struggling lawyer starting out 25 years ago, a quarter of a century, folks, just to time it because Tyler wanted me to, because I do what Tyler tells me to do.
Oh, stop.
So that is generally, by the way,
You
y'all
know,
want good
roughly.
advice.
All right,
Y'all want good
roughly.
advice.
I mean,
Just
here's the
what
thing.
Tyler says.
You put your birth date in your book. You can't really be that like, all right,
I
I don't
can't.
even know.
I know. I know.
Okay,
I know.
all
I
right,
know.
all right,
I know.
all right.
I'm like almost half a century old, man. It's wisdom is what it is. It's collective wisdom. And by the way, I don't know who's watching this in video, but Tyler's video system does not have any of the filters. So this is what I actually look like. And so I feel like you should have warned me so I could have done the thing that you're doing, which is sat like 7 feet back from the camera.
It's just a really good camera. Okay. It's a really good camera. That's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyways, okay. So what I was going to say is, you might choose to do what you want to do anyway. And I did. I wore pants 25 years ago and I wore ethnic earrings. And at that time, that was radical. I mean, it really was. I mean, it's maybe radical is a strong word.
Did
Was
you
gutsy.
let your hair down or was your hair up? Because that also I think was a big deal, right?
It was. So Persians have a thing with hair. I don't know if a lot of folks know a lot about Iran, but the whole cover your hair thing, culturally, we find hair to be, forgive me if you feel the word is inappropriate, but we find it to be titillating. And so that's why they want us to cover it up because it's titillating, right?
Okay.
And so for us, showing our hair is such an incredible political statement. I know that sounds
Liberating?
yes,
Okay.
it's my hair. I can do whatever I want with it. And that's how
I don't get this, but I understand what you're saying. I'm empathizing with you, but I can't totally relate, but I empathize with you.
Ladies and gentlemen, he can learn. He can be taught. It's incredible. And so, if I felt like putting it up, I put it up. If I thought that's what looked best with my outfit, I was in fashion. So the way I looked actually mattered a lot to me. And if I wanted to put it down, I put it down. So it was sort of, whatever I felt like doing with my hair, I did with my hair. And I always have ever since I got out of Iran. And it is remarkable, the symbolism of that for our people. And I know you like to let your hair down, Tyler. It's very luxurious, and I'm titillated by your hair personally. That's what I've been feeling the whole time. Yeah.
But just the expressiveness of that. And here's what's interesting. Say, for example, we've gone through so much of a world, whether it's political, whether it's, organizationally, where we've been told so many times, don't let the real you show. Okay. What you just shared about was an example of that. Growing up in Iran was an example of that. For me, growing up on a farm and trying to not be, ostracized for that, it was get away and don't let them show that you have anything like that. I talked to someone today. We were riding in the car together, and he's a young gentleman, probably in his early 20s, lives on a farm, and the older gentleman driving us, we had shuttle, right? And was just how different it was 30 years ago in my life, where you hid the idea that I grew up on a farm and around a farm, and hid that. No different than I would imagine there was probably in a point where you were trying to figure out, all right, what does this world look like? Let me try as much as I can to hide my Persian heritage, my, whatever that may be. And so what I have learned and found is it's really hard to empathize with people that are constantly trying to hide who they really are. And so when I think about this advent of really being that authentic person, which I try to impress, and as a leader, encouraging people, please be authentic, so that way I can understand more about you, so I can lead you better.
So I have a question for you, Tyler. And I ask you this because I think you're quite good at it. I think it's one thing to work on yourself because, again, at the end of the day, I fully believe that's where most of your control lies. How do you bring out the authenticity in others? I would love your personal advice on this because you're, like I said, you're quite good at this. You do this on your show. People start out, they're reserved, there's several steps removed, not me, of course, but, I'm a little bit of a crazy person. And by the end of the show, man, you've cracked them open. And do you have tips for the audience?
Well, it's funny you say that because my producer, Alex, who you've met, who's listening in the background,
Yeah.
has gone
He says
through.
I'm your favorite. That's what we were talking about.
That's what that has been documented. Favorite episode ever is, he's commented to that. I can sense it. And, it's even when I speak and I go to, corporate events and they're kind of like, well, how are you going to, like, I don't know. I know how I do it, but I don't know how I'm going to do it. But this is what I do know. What I've really learned is, and for me, it's embracing my insecurities. My biggest insecurity is, do I have value? Do I have worth? And that's what I've fought with since I was maybe 8 or 10 years old, and just trying to figure out, where's my place in this world? And what I had to learn is, and this is through a lot of the stuff that I've worked on, is my insecurities created walls around me. And that's what kept me from being empathetic with others and doing exactly what you've recognized, because what this connection is me practicing empathy because I'm willing to be vulnerable. I'm willing to share my own kind of, as I just shared with you. But what I've learned there is when I'm willing to go first, and not in a, oh, poor me victim. No. When I'm willing to go appropriately first, what that does is that creates a connection and then a relationship where then I have the ability to influence. So as you've just said, in this idea of leadership, and to me, why I love your book, is this idea of people need to further understand empathy because they don't understand it. You have 50 pages of your book just trying to help people understand what empathy is. I get that, right? I get it. It's true.
You're making me sound like Herman Melville at this point.
No,
There's 50 pages
it's
of
great.
wailing details.
No, it's not. It's great because it gives people an understanding of what it really is, because we don't get it. And, for me, that's why I try to come up with a simple definition. Put your arms around someone and walk with them. And so as you bringing up your question, and as I've seen this play out, as Alex has seen it play out, and I wish I could play it out with my kids and my wife sometimes, right? But this is what I know. The biggest barrier in my relationship with those closest to me is the barrier that keeps me from being able to lead, influence others. And that's my insecurity of, where do I sit in the relationship?
Do you feel that you're as vulnerable with your wife and kids as you are with your audiences?
Here's what's interesting about that is, and I think this goes back to something you said earlier, right? There's vulnerability of the circumstance. Am I willing to, be vulnerable with my children, my wife? Yeah. But yet, is it enough? Is it in the right ways that actually impacts that relationship? If you and I have walked together for 20 years, right? And all of a sudden I'm feeling like I'm being vulnerable and you're kind of like, dude, why are you so like vanilla? And I'm like, what do you mean? I don't think I am. Mm-hmm. Whereas like all of a sudden the flavor ice cream that I am, and somebody comes along and is like, oh, wow, this is really tasty, or this is different. I've never had this before. But if you've eaten it every day for 20 years, like, this is kind of, all right, it is what it is. And I think that's the dynamic there that in all relationships needs to continue to evolve. And I think what's imperative there is being willing to say, what I once knew is no longer the case, and this is what I have learned or experienced to make me believe it.
Yeah.
And that comes back to it's been a long process of personal growth, and it's still going to be a process, but I'm excited about it. Because and as I'm saying this, and I've never necessarily thought about it before, that's what's going to allow me to connect and be empathetic with others.
I love that. I love that. The thing that happens to a lot of us in our personal relationships, especially the partnerships, which are in many ways fundamentally different than parenting, for example, because parenting has a different type of responsibility attached to it, right? You're in charge, right? It's different with a partnership. You're supposed to be partners, right? Is this thing happens after, and I've been married for close to 20 years too. It's this thing happens when you sync your steps with someone else for a very, very long time, which is if they even flinch for a microsecond in taking a step, you notice it because you've been syncing your steps with them for so long, right? And so, what happens then to some people is if they don't want you to notice the flinch for any number of decent reasons, they hide it from you. And given the level of familiarity, hiding the flinch from you can be just as much of a hidden vulnerability or insecurity as hiding something far more substantial or bigger from someone who you know more. And this whole thing of familiarity breeding perhaps, I don't want to say discontent, but familiarity breeding boredom, right? Which is very
Yeah.
human, very human.
Yeah.
The way I think about it is no, I'm never going to taste this ice cream the same way as I did the first time or even the first 100 times. It's just not going to taste like that. Now, maybe the flavor will modify. And to your point, because I know this flavor so well, I can actually help it modify and improve in a way that maybe nobody else can. And this flavor can do the same thing to me, which is really kind of remarkable because everyone else is going to have a very limited understanding of my flavor profile, right? And so, but also, this flavor is my meatloaf. This flavor is my tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwich. This flavor is what I come home to. And maybe it doesn't have to knock my, sorry, I swore and then I bleeped myself, y'all. I still don't know what the rules are. I asked Tyler and he said, we're not recording yet.
Yeah.
So, but I don't know what that means for when we are
Okay. I
recording.
mean,
Okay. So
do
wait,
you?
can I swear? Okay,
Do you? Just do
it's
you.
just really
Just
hard
be
not
authentic. Whatever you feel is appropriate. Okay.
to. Here's the thing. Here's the thing. Whatever it is that I come home to is never going to be the same as the extraordinary new experience is. But I want to come home to it. And that extraordinary new experience, it's not going to be home unless I do it 1,000 more times, right? I could do it 1,000 more times. This is how people shift relationships and partners and alliances, right? But it is a substantial difference and commitment, right? It's not to say I'll never come home to another person, but there's something about that meatloaf. And if I keep, and again, for me, it's not meatloaf, it's like Khoresh de Bademjun, but I'm trying to appeal to your audience. Am
Hey,
I, am
I
I
was
appealing?
wondering what's okay, it's good. You explained it. It's awesome.
I'm sure you
Yeah.
could repeat it
Yeah.
verbatim
I mean,
with your fantastic
absolutely.
Persian skills.
Yeah.
So it's more like changing my expectation, right? This is my mother's meatloaf or my childhood meatloaf, except how cool is it? Because as I learn more about cooking and flavor profiles, I can help this meatloaf stay the same while enhancing. And they can do the same to me. Right. And so, it's like a friend of mine who started putting an avocado spread on her grilled cheese sandwich or something like that. It's just nothing you did as a kid. Right? But it's really good. And it doesn't mean you got to do it every time. But that doesn't mean there's no room for improvement, is my point. And so, this thing that we do with relationships where we hide our flinch, because it's just a flinch and I'm allowed to have a flinch and I don't need you to be aware of every single one of my flinches, right? And this thing that we do does hide us from the person we're with to a very, very large extent. And it also creates a me versus them mentality that makes it really hard to put my arm around someone. It's if I do this, then they'll respond in this way, right? And it's just much harder to sync your steps when you do that.
Here's where I believe there's a to use your same meatloaf, we talked about ice cream. one of the great opportunities is in relationships, whether it's a spousal relationship, whether it's a work relationship, whatever, is the opportunity to grow together. And that can start as something pretty benign to something much bigger. And this is what I would relate to and just kind of acknowledge that idea of that flinch. I think that's as evident in a new relationship as old relationship.
Mm,
And as the relationship gets older, we have a better sense of what it is. Initially, we don't know. And this is where I share the idea that, you mentioned earlier, and I kind of bring up when I'm able to recognize and say, yep, that's my insecurity showing. And the response is usually, oh, okay, that makes sense. I didn't know what it was, but I knew how you flinched. I knew there was a flinch. I could sense a flinch. I didn't really understand, but I also recognize then later on where, again, you've had this relationship, you've interacted with this person, you've gone through a leadership response, organization where you represented this client for 15 years, in whatever it may be. And all of a sudden there's one day and you're like, something a little off. All right, I know what it is. It's an insecurity. And maybe you can't name what it is, but you sense that, and that becomes the barrier. And I think going back to what you brought up in me and what I try and where it's so hard in those closest, is my vulnerability viewed as a way to create deeper empathy, or is it used as a manipulation?
yeah.
And I think that second part is what really hampers relationships, is if you start a new one, it's like, all right, how are they going to manipulate me? And then you're like, okay, no, it's not like that. And then all of a sudden you get to a point and somebody brings it up. It's like, are they trying to manipulate me? What's going on? And I think that's where it becomes so difficult.
Yeah. Woof. That is, you cut right to it. That is some powerful stuff. And it is so true. And it is a reality that empathy can make manipulation easier. And this is, I need to acknowledge this. This is not what I preach. And in fact, I have an entire chapter in my book dedicated to ethics and utilizing this material in a way that is ethical. And at the same time, I need to acknowledge the better I understand my opponent, whoever that might be, whether it's my husband or whether it is a bad guy trying to rob me, right?
Yeah.
The better I understand my opponent, the more I can control my opponent. That is in some ways a manipulation, and in some ways, right? Or certainly they might view it as that, especially if they would have wanted a different outcome, right? So,
Or if they've been victim of it.
yes. And or if you're just better at controlling the flow of the situation and the direction, I was a debater in high school, and then I studied philosophy with an emphasis on logic and argument and neuropsychology, and then I went to law school. And
Like
then I
all the
lived
great
with
things to
20
build an
years.
amazing lawyer.
My husband's like, how about we argue it rationally this time, but next time we do one-on-one basketball because that's the only way we can keep it fair vis-a-vis skill sets. And he's, it's a little unfair to him. I can guide it. So, and I get that, right? So the thing is, it's important to acknowledge that is a real concern, that concern is not made up. And it's not based on an insecurity or a lack of trust. Right. It's a real, it could be based on an insecurity or lack of trust.
Well, I would say it could be verified. It could be, now I interrupted you and I'm not finding the word, but it could be substantiated.
Yeah. Confirmed. So yes. And it could just be, I just don't trust you yet. You're new, right? And that's fair and appropriate, and that is how it should be. But it could also really, really be the case. That then, in my opinion, is the case for you need more than just empathy, right? That's not the case for you don't need empathy. That's the case for you need more than just empathy. right? Honest dialogue, communication, a certain level of base trust. There is, a continuous work done, at least in my marriage, of making sure we remain in alliance, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's very hard to prevent the me versus you mentality, especially when you've been taught to argue for almost half a century, right? And so and so maintaining the desire for the together we success and maintaining the focus on that and on that alliance, that takes work. There's a lot more work there than just empathy. But without empathy, you could never get there.
100%.
And yeah, so it is necessary, but not sufficient. And I think it's important to acknowledge that.
One of the elements that I recognize, which I think ties into this, and I hope it does, is, again, my definition, putting your arms around someone and walking with them. And what you just shared is there needs to be more, whether it's the attachment of emotional empathy to the cognitive empathy, as you've described in your book. And it's like that combination. For me, it's actionable. It takes action to be empathetic. And this is what I also recognize is you have to be in step. If I put my arms around someone and I am walking and I'm walking at a different pace than them and dragging them, it's not going to work. A person of faith and a Christian faith, and there's a very ancient piece that says, "Don't be unequally yoked." And what that means, if we go back to the age of having oxen, and if you're pulling a plow with two oxen and one of them pulls faster than the other, the one is going to choke the other out. Both of them are going to be choked out. And so as I envision that idea of being in empathy, you have to be in it together, and you have to go at a together pace. And I think that's what I hear as you describe. It has to be more, is I have to be willing to slow down or go faster based upon the other one so we stay in step, because that's that more. It's that emotional connection to the cognitive.
I love that. And I would say it is essential that you do that, because if I give you too much right away, that is risky, and it is a weakness. Let's be honest.
Yeah, if I throw up all over you in a relationship, you're like, whoa, they got problems.
Right. Or if I trust with my life every person I meet on the street, I mean, that's not the way to behave. Plenty of people trying to get you out there in this world, right? Now, if I modulate that based on an internal decision that I have made, and then a control that I have exhibited, and I teach control through Stoicism, right? That's the second half of the book. The first half of the book is empathy. Second half of the book is Stoicism. But there's other ways. There's other ways for folks to figure out how to regulate their system emotionally. I think Stoicism is the best way. But there is control over that modulation. And it also doesn't mean I put people in buckets. This person I'm going to go all the way with. This person I'm not going to go any of the way with, because it could be right now, this person having, I don't know, suffered a deep loss, or in the middle of a hormonal shift, or in a major depression, or whatever it might be. I have to be more cautious right now, even though my long-term approach is one of greater trust, because of what's happening in this person's life, or even in my own life, or even from morning to afternoon, you could be different. Right? So it's just like entering into that social contract with full awareness and control over yourself, or as much as you can, right? Hopefully more than you have now, hopefully with the help of the book, right? As much as you can, so that you can modulate between this spectrum, because it's really not binary, cognitive or emotional, right? It's a spectrum.
And you touch about this, because that spectrum is there's a difference between, if you're listening, they're just thinking, okay, practicing empathy and practicing this idea of I have to find this authenticity and be more vulnerable. The challenge for me is I was an a-hole before. I was just a straight up asshole. And that's what kept me from being empathetic. At the same point, you kind of bring up in your book too, if you're a doormat and you let people walk all over you, you're not being empathetic either. That's not, that you may think, oh, I'll just be everything to everyone. No, You got to
That's
stand up
just
for
weak.
yourself. But it's
Yeah.
finding that midpoint, the healthy empathy, as I described, which you very much describe as well, as kind of this be aware of empathy collapse, which to me is either being an asshole or being a doormat. You can't do that either way. It's finding that midpoint and understanding it's not a Ronco set it and forget it. It is an oscillated, there's a temperance to it based upon the situation, the time of day, right? Whatever thing's going on. I think that's what makes it hard for people. And they're like, well, I just don't know if I want to go there.
And I gotta say, I really appreciate your characterization. I will say, I didn't know you back when you were an asshole, but I would
There's enough
assume
people to
I'm sure
verify
that
is
people
true.
can
Yeah.
corroborate the
Yeah.
truth
Yeah.
of that statement.
Yeah.
What I wanted to say is you don't actually have to be an asshole to have empathy collapse. I have experienced empathy collapse in the field. Trauma surgeons experience empathy collapse. My sister works with the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. And she's given me instances where she's experienced, I mean, she's been in the field and what she's seeing is terrifying. And yet she doesn't feel it the way she did 10 years ago, 15 years ago, right? When she was in Nigeria, she had to be choppered in and out of the field because of the Boko Haram activity in the area. I mean, she is in all these areas, but with no guns. She doesn't have a gun, which is crazy. And so that's the situation she's in. So you don't have to be an asshole. And in fact, the thing is, sometimes intentionally, emotionally closing yourself off is the best way to assist the individual with whom you are existing in that space. But sometimes it is something that you're automatically doing because you're exhausted, right? Or you've been betrayed, or whatever your reasons are.
Especially as a leader, right? You get overwhelmed. You're just like, you start to shut off. And then that is oftentimes, people are like, oh, they don't care.
Right. Oh, in relationships. Imagine being in a relationship with someone who has chronic pain. At some point, if they say, oh, I have another migraine, I say this as a migraine sufferer, by the way. Oh, I have another migraine. How are they supposed to still feel bad for me? I mean, I have so many freaking migraines.
Figure it out, right? Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, yeah. So A, I try to understand that. And B, as the person in the relationship who's encountering that empathy collapse, I also have to remind myself that I want to be careful not to automatically go into collapse and at this time. And therefore, what I want to do, maybe I can't feel all the feelings, but I can have the rational understanding in this moment, no matter what, so that I can assist my partner or this patient or this refugee, as the case might be.
Or client or coworker or whoever. We've talked a lot about your book, Stoic Empathy. Where can people, when's it released? Where can they buy it? We'll start with those two.
I appreciate it. Thank you. It'll be everywhere. It'll be at Target, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. If you want to go to your favorite independent bookstore and request that they carry it, that would be awesome. They can do that. It will be available April 8th, and it should be in text in audiobook format as well as on ebook format. So you can get it. I had to record the audiobook. By the way, it's a different story for a different time because we need to wrap up now because it's been an hour and you told me 40 to 45 minutes. And I'm just one of those people. I raise my hand a lot in class. I'm that annoying girl. I sit at the front. Yeah, it's bad. It's bad. So anyway, it's another time I will tell you the story of how recording my audiobook was one of the most difficult things I have ever had to do in my life. So
Okay.
maybe you'll have me back on the show.
Okay. We'll talk about that.
I will talk about that.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. What is again, we've talked a lot about empathy. You've been very gracious to hear my exploration of empathy. But for those that, are going to go read the book, what's the biggest thing that they will really grasp out of that book in your mind?
So I would say I try very, very hard to present the book in terms of tools. So in the empathy section, which is the first half of the book, there's essentially 5 subsections that tell you how to better understand people, right? So it's not just, hey, try to understand people. It's how do I actually go about doing that, right? So those tools, right? Let's say one of them is active listening, right? Which is something you engaged in a lot in this conversation, right? Let's say another one is how to ask good questions, right? Questions that don't shut the other person down, but actually get them to open up. And then in the second half of the book, which is primarily about stoicism, self-control, how do I engage in this modulation between emotional and cognitive empathy? And that one also has 5 tools. And those are Stoic tools, which is, hey, what is this whole memento mori thing? What is it about? What does embracing death mean as a way of regulating my emotions on a day-to-day basis? And then we explain it. And then we give you, literally at the end of the chapter, we give you exercises. So here's 5 ways. And I like to make people write their obituary, which is a little Wednesday Addams of me, but it actually, there's a rhythm, there's a rhythm there. And so the book will do that. It will give you, hey, here's a few ways for you to, here's why you should be stoic and empathetic. Here's a few ways for you to be empathetic, right? And here's a few ways for you to be a little bit more stoic than you were yesterday and continue to build on it forever. So you could be new to stoicism, or you could have been practicing it for 47 years, as I have, and still hopefully walk away with a few nuggets from the book. So I really hope that it'll be useful. So it's less philosophy and more helpful tips. I do think there's a fair bit of philosophy in there. So that is what it is. But yeah, I really hope that your readers find it useful and helpful. And I would love to hear from you guys. You can also go to my website and just let me know, hey, this part of the book really resonated with me, or I would have loved to have heard more about this, or I didn't quite get this. Could you explain it differently? And I'll do my best, A, to respond to you, but B, to resolve it in my next book.
What website can people go to?
SherminKruse.com. It's only the easiest thing to spell in the entire world.
Yeah,
so yeah, maybe Tyler could put a link.
It'll be in the show notes. Absolutely. Shermin, thank you so much. I appreciate you being here. For all of you watching on YouTube, which you've probably enjoyed this episode for sure, make sure to hit the subscribe button as well as the bell to get notified whenever we drop new content. Those of you listening, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen, if you could do this, if you could rate and review this episode, that would be spectacular. That way, more people can learn about Shermin and her work. Until next time, choose to lead with impact.